The year was 1885, and the Montana Territory was already surrendering to an early and unforgiving winter. The vast sky, a brilliant, piercing blue during the fleeting summer months, had hardened into a sheet of slate gray. A wind that carried the scent of pine and distant snow swept down from the northern peaks, sharp enough to steal the breath from a man's lungs. It scoured the high plains, whipping the red dust into eddies that danced like troubled spirits before freezing it to the iron-hard ground. The cottonwoods that lined the shallow, fast-moving creeks had long since shed their gold, their skeletal branches now clawing at the oppressive sky. This was a land that did not offer comfort, only demanded resilience. It was a place of stark, raw beauty and an even starker reality, a place that either forged a person into something as unyielding as the rock beneath their feet, or broke them entirely. On the lonely fringe of this landscape, miles from the nearest cluster of humanity, stood a log cabin. It was not a home built with an eye for grace, but a fortress assembled with brute strength and grim purpose. The logs were thick, the gaps chinked tight with a mixture of mud and moss that had frozen solid. A single stone chimney breathed a thin plume of gray smoke into the heavier gray of the sky. This was the world of Eli Carter, a world he had deliberately shrunk to the size of this cabin and the small parcel of land around it. Inside, the silence was a living thing, broken only by the crackle of the fire in the hearth and the soft hum of a child at play. Eli sat at the rough-hewn table, his large hands, calloused and mapped with the fine white scars of a blacksmith's trade, meticulously repairing a leather strap on his daughter's small boot. He was a man built of straight lines and hard angles, from his broad shoulders to his square jaw, often shadowed with a day's worth of stubble. His eyes, the color of a winter river, held a deep and settled quiet, the kind that comes to a man who has had too much to say in the past and found it worthless. He rarely spoke unless a question required an answer, and even then, his words were as spare and functional as the furniture in his cabin. He had been a cavalryman before he was a blacksmith, a man who had seen the country from the back of a horse and witnessed the expansion of a nation written in blood and iron. Now, all he wanted was to be left alone with the only part of his past that still held any light: his daughter, Rosie. Rosie, at 5 years old, was the cabin's sole source of warmth that did not come from the fire. She sat on a bearskin rug, her dark hair a stark contrast to the pale wood of the floor, arranging a small family of pinecone people. She had her mother's eyes, deep and dark, and full of a light that Eli fought every day to protect. She would chatter to her pinecone family in a soft voice, creating stories of grand adventures that never ventured beyond the cabin walls. Eli would listen, the corner of his mouth sometimes twitching with a ghost of a smile. Raising her was his penance and his purpose, the one duty that kept his heart beating in the hollow cavern of his chest. He would feed her, protect her, and teach her what he could, and that would be enough. He did not need other people. Other people brought judgment, and noise, and trouble. He had buried enough trouble along with his wife. The town of Broken Horse was a day's ride away, but it felt like a different country. It was little more than a single muddy street carved into the wilderness, a place that had sprung up to service the silver mine gouged into the nearby hills. It was a town that smelled of coal smoke, cheap whiskey, and unwashed men. The buildings were raw timber, leaning against each other for support, their signs painted in crude, hopeful letters: saloon, general store, ask Sayer. There was no church, no schoolhouse, and the only law was the kind that Sheriff Brody, a man whose gut preceded him by a good 2 feet, felt like enforcing on any given day. The men of Broken Horse were miners with dust in their lungs and a constant thirst, or they were traders who dealt in the tools of survival and violence, selling firearms and ammunition to anyone with coin. It was a place where a man's worth was measured by the weight of his purse or the speed of his draw, and compassion was a currency with no value. Into this world of hard men and harder realities walked Mary Dalton, though she did not so much walk as she was pushed. She had arrived in Broken Horse a month prior, having found work as a maid for the mine supervisor's wife. A woman with a face perpetually pinched in disapproval. The position had lasted only until a pearl necklace went missing. Mary, with her worn clothes and her status as a newcomer with no one to speak for her, was the immediate and convenient suspect. She swore her innocence, her voice trembling with a desperate sincerity that was mistaken for guilt. She was dismissed without a reference, the accusation clinging to her like the fine, choking dust of the town itself. With no money and nowhere to go, she took a small room above the saloon, paying for it by scrubbing floors and washing glasses, enduring the leering stares and coarse jokes of the patrons. It was there, in the stale air of the saloon, that her fate was sealed by a cruel bit of sport. A group of off-duty miners, flush with whiskey and boredom, watched her. They saw the quiet desperation in her eyes, the way she flinched when they spoke to her, and they found it amusing. Bo Sterling, the foreman's son, a man whose arrogance was his most prominent feature, was the one who hatched the idea. "Look at her," he drawled, tipping his chair back like a scared rabbit. "Bet you she'd believe anything if it meant a way out of here." His companions, Jebediah and Silas, chuckled in agreement. "What you got in mind?" Bo Silas asked, wiping beer foam from his mustache. "That widower," Bo said, a sly grin spreading across his face. "Carter, the one who lives out on the ridge, the one who married that Comanche woman." He spat on the floor. "Heard he's got a little girl. A man like that, alone with a child, he must need help." The lie took shape with gleeful collaboration. They called for paper and a pen. Bo, who prided himself on his passable handwriting, began to compose the letter. He wrote as if he were Eli Carter, a man of simple, direct needs. He wrote of a daughter in need of a woman's care, a home in need of a housekeeper's hand. He wrote of fair wages and a quiet life, a respectable position far from the grime of Broken Horse. Every word was a carefully crafted falsehood, designed to hook the hope of a desperate woman. They passed the letter around, snickering at their own ingenuity. It was the perfect prank. Carter was such a recluse he would never hear about it, and the girl would make a fool of herself, trekking all the way out to his cabin in the middle of nowhere for a job that did not exist. They gave the letter to the bartender, with a coin to ensure he passed it to Mary. When she received the folded paper, her hands shook. She took it to her small room, the noise and raucous laughter from the saloon below a distant rumble. She read the words by the light of a single candle, and for the first time in a long time, a fragile seed of hope began to sprout in the barren soil of her heart. A real job, a home, a chance to care for a child, to be needed, to be something other than the thieving maid from Broken Horse. She knew of Eli Carter. She had heard the whispers. A strange man. They said, a man who kept to himself, a man who had defied convention by marrying an Indian woman, who had then died in some tragic, unspoken way. The town's gossip painted him as a surly, perhaps dangerous figure, but the letter was not surly. It was direct, and it offered a lifeline. Mary, who had been offered nothing but suspicion and scorn, could not afford to question it. To question it would be to extinguish the only flicker of light in her darkness. This was a chance. It might be her last. She spent her last few coins to hire a ride with a freight wagon driver heading part of the way out of town. He was a taciturn man who grunted when she told him her destination. Carter's place, he'd said, eyeing the darkening sky. "Storm's coming. Miss, a bad one. You sure you want to be heading out there?" "I am sure," Mary had replied, her voice more confident than she felt. She clutched her small bundle of belongings, her gaze fixed on the horizon, where the mountains were already being swallowed by thick, bruised-looking clouds. The wagon left her at a fork in the road, the driver pointing a gloved finger down a barely visible track. His cabin's a few miles that way. "Follow the creek. Can't miss it." And with a crack of his whip, he was gone, leaving Mary alone with the rising wind. The first flakes of snow began to fall, small and wet, melting on her worn coat. She pulled her shawl tighter around her head and began to walk. The track was rough, and the wind grew stronger, howling through the pines, driving the snow now in a thick, stinging curtain. Her hope, so bright and warm in her small room, began to feel like a foolish, naive thing out here in the face of the storm's fury. Meanwhile, in his cabin, Eli Carter had just finished reading a story to Rosie. He tucked her into her small bed, the warmth of the fire casting a gentle glow on her sleeping face. He stood there for a long moment, watching her, a fierce, protective love swelling in his chest. This was his world. This was his peace. He banked the fire for the night, the embers glowing like dormant promises. Outside, the storm raged, blanketing the world in a deep and silent white. He was oblivious to the woman struggling through the blizzard, a forged letter clutched in her frozen hand, a false hope her only guide. Their separate, lonely worlds, one fortified by silence and the other battered by deceit, were about to collide, brought together by a casual act of cruelty in a land that was indifferent to both their pain and their longing for a place to finally call home. The wind was a living creature, a predator screaming around the corners of the cabin. It clawed at the roof and hurled itself against the heavy oak door, testing the limits of Eli's handiwork. He had finished banking the fire and was about to turn toward his own simple cot when he heard it. It was a sound so faint, so alien to the storm's violent symphony, that he at first dismissed it as a trick of the wind, a branch scraping against the logs, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like a frantic bird's heartbeat. He stood perfectly still, his head cocked, listening past the gale. There it was again, more insistent this time, a desperate, fluttering percussion against the wood. It was a knock. No one came to his cabin, no one, especially not in a blizzard that had descended with the speed and fury of a divine punishment. Caution, a lesson learned in battle and hardened by loss, took over. He moved silently across the floorboards, his bare feet making no sound. He took the heavy rifle from its pegs above the mantelpiece, the cold steel a familiar and reassuring weight in his hands. He did not bother to light a lamp. The glow from the hearth was enough. He reached the door, the rifle held ready, and listened one last time. Only the wind answered. With his free hand, he lifted the heavy iron bar that secured the door and pulled it open just enough to see. A blast of white fury exploded into the room, a whirlwind of snow and ice that momentarily blinded him. And in that maelstrom, a figure stood, or rather, slumped against the doorframe. It was a woman, a ghost made of ice and desperation. Her coat and dress were plastered to her thin frame, soaked through and already stiffening with frost. Her face was a pale, bloodless white, her lips a startling shade of violet. Snow was caked in her hair and eyelashes, and she was shaking with a violence that seemed to threaten to tear her apart from the inside out. She looked at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and pleading, and then her strength gave out entirely, and she began to crumple forward. Instinct, older and deeper than his solitude, moved him. This was not a threat. This was a person on the verge of freezing to death on his doorstep. He set the rifle against the wall, stepped out into the biting cold, and hooked his arm around her waist, pulling her out of the storm and into the relative warmth of the cabin. She was shockingly light, a bundle of wet wool and shivering bones. He kicked the door shut against the howling wind, the heavy wood thudding into place, and the roar of the storm was instantly muffled, reduced to a distant complaint. The silence of the cabin rushed back in, now thick with the presence of a stranger. She stumbled and would have fallen had he not held her up. He guided her toward the hearth, her teeth chattering so loudly it sounded like stones rattling in a tin cup. He eased her down onto the bearskin rug, her body slumping into a miserable heap. For a moment, he just stood there, looking down at this wreck of a human being who had washed up at his isolated shore. Then he moved with the grim efficiency of a man accustomed to emergencies. He pulled a heavy wool blanket from his own bed and wrapped it tightly around her shaking shoulders. He turned to the fireplace, grabbed the iron poker, and jabbed at the glowing embers, breaking them apart. He laid 2 more thick logs onto the bed of coals. A weak flame flickered, caught, and then roared to life, sending a wave of heat and dancing light across the room. He stoked the fire, his movements sure and practiced, his focus entirely on the task of creating warmth, of pushing back the deadly cold that clung to her. He fetched a tin cup and filled it with water from the bucket near the door, placing it on the hearthstone to warm. The woman, Mary, was slowly beginning to thaw. The violent shudders were lessening into a continuous, exhausted tremor. She pulled the blanket tighter, her gaze fixed on the mesmerizing flames. When he handed her the cup of warm water, her fingers were so numb she could barely hold it. He had to steady her hands with his own. His touch was impersonal, the contact brief and functional, but it was the first human warmth she had felt in what seemed like an eternity. She drank the water in small, careful sips. Color was slowly returning to her face, a faint pink blush on her high cheekbones. Finally, her gaze lifted from the fire and met his. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice a raw, hoarse sound. Eli gave a curt nod. "You would have died out there. It was a statement of fact, not a bid for gratitude. What are you doing on this ridge in the middle of a blizzard?" Her eyes filled with a fresh wave of anxiety. This was the moment. She reached a trembling hand into the pocket of her wet dress and pulled out a damp, crumpled piece of paper. She held it out to him. "Your letter," she said, her voice still weak. "I came for the position, the housekeeping job, to look after your daughter." Eli stared at the paper she was offering, his brow furrowed in confusion. He did not take it. "My letter." "Yes," she said, a note of desperation creeping into her voice. "It said you needed someone." He finally took the letter from her. The paper was soft and pulpy from the damp. He unfolded it carefully and held it toward the firelight. He saw the neat, looping script, a stranger's hand. He read the words that offered a job he had never imagined, a wage he could not pay, a request for help he would never have made. As he read, his face, already a mask of stoicism, seemed to harden into granite. He understood immediately. The lies were plain enough, but the casual cruelty behind them was what settled like a cold stone in his gut. Broken horse. It had the town's stink all over it. A mean-spirited prank played on a desperate woman. A cold anger, quiet and dangerous, began to simmer deep inside him. The small sound from the doorway broke the tense silence. Both he and Mary looked up. Rosie stood there in her long white nightgown, her small hand rubbing the sleep from her eyes, her dark hair a wild tangle around her head. She blinked in the firelight, her gaze falling on the unfamiliar woman huddled on the rug. A woman with long, dark hair, not unlike her mother's had been, in the sleepy, disoriented world of a child roused from a dream. She saw a shape, a presence that had been missing for so long. "Mama." The word was a soft, hopeful question, but it struck the air in the cabin like a physical blow. It made Mary flinch as if she had been slapped. It pierced through Eli's armor, a direct hit to the most vulnerable part of him. The memory of his wife, Sarah, rose up unbidden, so sharp and clear it stole his breath, her laugh, the scent of wildflowers in her hair, the feel of her hand in his. The pain of it was as fresh as the day he had lost her. An unbearable, awkward silence descended, thick with grief and confusion. Mary stared at the child, her heart aching with a sorrow that was not her own. Eli recovered first, his voice rougher than usual. "Rosie, go back to bed. It is nothing." The child, sensing the tension, retreated without another word, a small, ghost-like figure disappearing back into the shadows of her room. Mary looked down at the letter still clutched in her hand, then back up at Eli's grim, unreadable face. The truth was there, in his silence, in the hard set of his jaw. The neat handwriting on the page seemed to mock her, each word a testament to her own foolishness. She had been so eager to believe, so ready to trade her miserable existence for a promise on a piece of paper. She was the town's fool after all. They were probably still laughing about it in the saloon, imagining her lost and freezing, chasing a phantom job. The realization, coming on the heels of her near-death experience, was the final weight that her spirit could not bear. A single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek, then another. Soon, she was crying, not with loud, histrionic sobs, but with a quiet, broken-hearted weeping that was far more terrible to witness. It was the sound of utter defeat, the final surrender of a soul that had been prodded and pushed and ridiculed one too many times. Eli stood frozen, a reluctant sentinel to her misery. Every instinct screamed at him to retreat, to shut down. He had built his life on avoiding this very thing, raw, messy, female emotion. It was a language that spoke of attachments, of needs, of a vulnerability he had sworn off forever. It reminded him of Sarah's tears, of his own helplessness in the face of the town's hatred for her. He wanted to order this woman out of his house and back into the storm, to reclaim his hard-won, silent peace. But then he looked from her shaking shoulders to the dark doorway where Rosie had stood. The echo of that one word, Mama, still hung in the air, a ghost in the room. He pictured turning this woman out, the door closing on her, leaving her to the blizzard's mercy. He imagined finding her in the morning, a frozen mound in the snow, and he knew he could not do it. He could not live with that. The man he had been, the soldier, the husband, would not allow it. More importantly, the father he was now could not let his daughter's home be the place where a desperate person was sent to their death. His voice, when he finally spoke, was as rough as gravel. You can stay the night. Mary's weeping subsided into shuddering breaths. She looked up at him, her eyes red and swollen. Just until the storm breaks, he added, his tone making it clear that this was an act of necessity, not of welcome. The floor by the fire is warm. You can sleep there. She could only nod, too exhausted and heartsick to speak. He laid another blanket on the floor for her, then retreated to the far side of the cabin, putting as much distance between them as the small room would allow. He sat in a chair in the shadows, the rifle resting across his knees, and prepared to wait out the night. The storm raged outside, and a different, more complicated storm had just begun inside, trapping two strangers in a fragile truce, their pasts and their pain the only things they unknowingly had in common. The world was born anew in a silent, blinding whiteness. Mary awoke on the floor to a room filled with a strange, diffused light, the kind that filters through thick layers of snow. The fire in the hearth had been stoked and was burning with a quiet, steady warmth. For a moment, she felt a disorienting sense of peace, the terror of the previous night a distant, dreamlike memory. Then she saw the man, Eli Carter, sitting at the table, cleaning his rifle, his movements economical and precise. The memory returned with a flush of shame that was hotter than the fire's glow. The letter, the storm, the child's heartbreaking question. She was an intruder, a fool, a charity case. She sat up, the coarse blanket pooling around her waist. Her dress and coat, which he must have moved while she slept, were hanging from a peg near the fire, stiff and steaming slightly. "My things," she said, her voice a croak. Eli did not look up from his work. "They will be dry soon enough." His tone was flat, offering no comfort. She scrambled to her feet, her body stiff and sore. She had to leave. Every moment she stayed was another moment of humiliation. She went to the cabin's single window and scraped away a small patch of frost with her fingernail. What she saw made her heart sink. The world outside was gone, buried. The snow was not merely a blanket. It was a smothering weight, piled in massive, sculptural drifts against the cabin, reaching halfway up the window itself. The familiar shapes of trees were softened into white mounds, and the path she had followed was utterly obliterated. There was no road, no creek, no landmark. There was only an endless, undulating sea of white under a heavy, sunless sky. "I must go," she said, more to herself than to him. Go where he asked without pausing his work. There is nowhere to go. The drifts are higher than a man's head in places. You would not make it 100 yards. The finality in his voice extinguished the last ember of her desperate pride. She was trapped with this silent, grim man and the ghosts that haunted his home. She turned from the window, her shoulders slumping in defeat. "I have no right to stay," she whispered. He finally stopped his work, sliding a freshly oiled cloth down the long barrel of the rifle before setting it aside. He looked at her then, his gaze direct and unsettling. It was not a cruel look, but it was entirely devoid of pity. "You have no choice," he stated simply. "You can stay here until the weather clears and the trail is passable. You will eat my food and sleep by my fire. But you owe me nothing, and I owe you nothing. When you can leave, you will leave. Is that understood?" The terms were as harsh and as clear as the winter landscape. He was offering survival, not sanctuary. It was more than she could have expected. She gave a small, jerky nod. Understood. The days that followed fell into a strange, unspoken rhythm, governed by silence and necessity. A house of silence. That is what it was. Eli spoke only to give Rosie a simple instruction or to answer a direct question from Mary, and even then, his answers were clipped. Yet the silence was not empty. It was filled with the small sounds of life, the scrape of a spoon against a bowl, the soft thud of an axe as Eli split firewood outside, the rustle of pages as Mary, finding a tattered primer, began to teach Rosie her letters. Mary, unable to bear the weight of idleness, made herself useful. She was not seeking his approval, but rather trying to carve out a space for herself, to feel like something more than a piece of unwanted baggage. She cooked, making stews from the salted meat and dried beans she found in his pantry. The food was simple, but it was hot and filling, and the aroma began to make the cabin smell less like a bachelor's lonely outpost and more like a home. She washed their clothes in a wooden tub with harsh lye soap, her hands turning red and raw in the cold water. She swept the floors, mended Rosie's dress, and tidied the small, cluttered space with a quiet efficiency. And she played with Rosie. This was her true salvation. The little girl, at first shy and watchful, slowly warmed to her presence. Mary taught her cat's cradle, her fingers weaving intricate patterns with a piece of string. She told her stories her own mother had told her, tales of clever foxes and foolish bears. Soon, the cabin, which had for so long held only the solitary hum of a child's play, was filled with the sound of Rosie's bright, silvery laughter. It was a sound that seemed to physically chip away at the frost on the window panes. Eli observed it all from his fortress of silence. He never offered a word of praise or thanks. Yet Mary began to notice things. One morning, the heavy cabin door, which had always emitted a loud, grating squeal, swung open silently. He had oiled the hinges while she and Rosie slept. When he saw her shivering one evening, he placed another log on the fire without a word. He would return from checking his trap lines and leave a brace of rabbits by the door, his contribution to the larder, and each morning she would find a cup of hot, weak tea waiting for her on the hearth, a small, silent acknowledgement that her presence, while unsought, was now a part of the day's routine. These were not gestures of kindness, she told herself. They were practicalities, but they were something. One afternoon, while she was sweeping near the small shelf that held Eli's few possessions, she saw it, a small, oval frame, the wood dark with age. Inside, under a piece of dusty glass, was a photograph of a woman. She was beautiful, with high cheekbones, a strong jaw, and long, dark braids that fell over her shoulders. Her eyes were dark and proud, and they seemed to look right through the camera, as if seeing something far off in the distance. There was a wildness in her, an untamed spirit that the rigid formality of the photograph could not contain. This had to be Sarah, Rosie's mother, a Comanche woman. Mary felt a pang of a feeling she could not name. It was not jealousy, but a profound curiosity mixed with a strange sense of kinship. She wondered what this woman's story was, what her life had been like in this silent cabin with this silent man. She looked over at Eli, who was mending a harness by the window, his face set in its usual stoic lines. She knew better than to ask. This was a door he had barred and locked, and she did not dare to knock. But children have no such inhibitions. A few days later, as Mary was helping Rosie draw letters on a piece of slate, the little girl looked up, her expression serious. "You have hair like Mama," she said. Mary smiled, touching one of Rosie's braids. Did she have long hair? Rosie nodded vigorously. Long and black, and she made the best corn cakes. But the people in the town did not like her. Mary's hand stilled. "Why not, sweetie?" Rosie's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper, as if repeating a forbidden secret she had overheard. They said she was bad. They were mean to her. Papa got angry when they were mean. She looked toward her father, who was pointedly staring out the window, his back rigid. Rosie's innocent words had landed in the silent room with the force of a thrown stone, revealing the deep, jagged crack in Eli's past. In that moment, Mary understood. She was not the first woman to feel the scorn of Broken Horse. Sarah, with her proud Comanche blood, had been an outsider, a target for the town's prejudice and fear. And Eli, by loving her, had set himself against them all. His isolation was not just a preference, it was a shield, a wall he had built to protect his family from the ugliness he could not defeat. A sudden, fierce empathy for this hard, silent man bloomed in her chest. A week passed, and the world outside began to change. The relentless gray sky finally broke, and a weak, watery sun appeared, making the endless snowfields glitter with a painful brilliance. The snow began to melt, the steady drip, drip, drip from the eaves a constant reminder that Mary's time in this strange limbo was coming to an end. One afternoon, Rosie complained of being cooped up. The air was warmer, and Mary, feeling a bout of cabin fever herself, agreed to a short walk. She bundled Rosie up, and they ventured out, their boots sinking into the wet, heavy snow. They walked down the newly visible trail, Rosie laughing as she tried to catch the melting drips from the pine branches. They had not intended to go far, but the taste of fresh air was intoxicating. Before she knew it, they had rounded a bend and the raw, ugly buildings of Broken Horse were visible in the distance. A group of men were standing outside the saloon, their shapes dark against the snow. Mary's heart seized. She recognized them instantly. It was Bo Sterling and his cronies. She turned to lead Rosie back, but it was too late. They had been seen. Well, look what the thaw washed up Bo's voice, slick with mockery, carried across the still air. If it ain't the lovelorn maid, did you enjoy your stay with the widower, little lady? His friends, Jebediah and Silas, erupted in coarse laughter. Mary's face burned with a hot, tidal wave of shame. She grabbed Rosie's hand and began walking quickly back toward the cabin, her head down. "Hey, where you going?" Bo called after her. "Didn't he treat you right? Maybe you should have answered my letters instead. I'd have shown you a much better time." The laughter followed them, cruel and sharp, chasing them up the path. Rosie, confused and frightened by the men's tone, began to cry. Mary scooped her up without breaking her stride, her own tears blurring the path ahead. She ran, her lungs burning, not stopping until the cabin was in sight. She did not know that Eli, returning from the woods, had been standing in the shadow of the trees just off the path. He had seen the entire exchange. He had seen the sneering faces of the men, had heard their taunts. He had seen the shame on Mary's face and the tears on his daughter's. An old, familiar rage. A black, volcanic fury he had kept banked for years, roared to life inside him. His body moved before his mind had fully caught up. He started walking toward the town, his long strides eating up the ground. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides, the knuckles white. He was halfway there. His vision tunneled on the group of laughing men, when Mary's choked sobs as she passed him finally broke through his rage. He stopped. He looked back at the woman and child retreating to the safety of his home. Violence would solve nothing. It would only bring more trouble to his door, more pain for Rosie to witness. He had learned that lesson the hard way. He turned and followed them back to the cabin, the fury still churning in his gut like a sickness. Mary was inside, comforting the still whimpering Rosie. She would not look at him. The shame was a wall between them now, thicker and colder than the one his silence had built. He said nothing. He simply took his rifle from the wall, checked the load, and went back outside. That night, after Mary and Rosie were asleep, he did not go to his own bed. He pulled a chair to the door and sat there, the rifle across his lap, his gaze fixed on the dark, snow-covered trail leading to his home. He sat there all night, a silent, unmoving guardian. The fire in the hearth burned low, but the fire in his eyes burned with a cold, steady light. He was no longer just a man waiting for a storm to pass. He was a man protecting his house. He was afraid someone might come back, afraid of what the town's casual cruelty might escalate to. And he was no longer just protecting his daughter. He was protecting the woman who had brought laughter back into his home, only to have it stolen away by the same darkness that had taken everything from him once before. The quiet that followed the encounter with the men from town was heavier and more brittle than any silence that had come before. The laughter from the saloon seemed to have followed Mary back to the cabin, echoing in the rafters, poisoning the small measure of peace she had found. She moved about her chores with a leaden weariness, her eyes fixed on the floorboards. Unable to meet Eli's gaze, he, in turn, retreated even deeper into himself. His silence no longer just a habit but a brooding, coiled thing. The house was once again a house of silence, but now it was a place of shared shame, a wound that neither of them knew how to dress. This fragile, miserable peace was shattered 2 days later. The brief thaw had been a lie, a cruel trick played by the sky. A new storm gathered in the north, not with the slow creep of the first, but with the sudden, violent rush of an invading army. The sky turned the color of a fresh bruise, and the wind began to moan. A low, mournful sound that quickly rose to a high-pitched shriek. It struck the cabin not as a gale, but as a solid wall of force. The first casualty was the door. The heavy iron bar Eli had set in place held, but the wooden frame, weakened by age, could not. With a sound like a gunshot, the wood around the latch splintered and the door was blasted inward, slamming against the interior wall. A tidal wave of snow and wind surged into the room, extinguishing the lantern on the table and sending the embers in the hearth skittering across the floor. Papers, Rosie's slate, and a half-mended shirt were whipped into a chaotic vortex. For a heartbeat, they were all frozen. Then Eli was moving. The door he roared over the scream of the wind. He fought his way into the teeth of the blizzard, his shoulders squared against the onslaught, and threw his full weight against the bucking wood. Mary, her own fear forgotten in the face of the immediate crisis, was right behind him. She grabbed the heavy table, her muscles straining, and began to drag it across the floor, wedging it against the door to brace it. The wind was a physical beast, pushing back with an incredible, relentless power. Just as they managed to secure the door, a new sound began, a steady, rhythmic dripping. Mary looked up. A dark stain was spreading on the ceiling boards directly above Rosie's bed. The roof, pummeled by the wind, had sprung a leak. Water, frigid and dirty, began to fall in a steady, miserable stream onto the small cot. "Get her out of there," Eli shouted. Mary scrambled to Rosie's bed, where the little girl sat bolt upright, her eyes wide with fear. Mary scooped her up, blankets and all, and carried her to the relative safety of the bearskin rug by the fire, hushing her cries and stroking her hair. Eli grabbed the empty water bucket and placed it under the leak. Then he began to pull on his heavy coat and boots. "What are you doing?" Mary cried, her voice thin with alarm. "The roof," he said, his jaw set. "A loose shingle. The wind will tear a hole in it if I do not fix it. I will pack it with snow. It will freeze and hold until the storm passes." To go out on the roof in this gale was madness, a dance with death. But before she could protest further, he had taken a coil of rope from a peg, tied one end around the stone chimney support, and disappeared out the broken door, pulling it shut behind him. The minutes stretched into an eternity. Mary could hear him above them, the heavy, scraping sounds of his boots on the roof, the muffled thuds as he packed snow into the damaged shingles. She sat by the fire, holding Rosie tight, her prayers a silent, frantic litany against the howling of the wind. When he finally stumbled back inside, he was a creature of ice, his beard and eyebrows white with frozen snow, his face raw from the wind. The leak had slowed to a mere occasional drip. He collapsed into a chair, his chest heaving, his body racked with shudders. Without a word, Mary took a cloth, dipped it in the warm water from the kettle, and began to gently wipe the ice from his face. He did not pull away. He simply sat there, his eyes closed, and allowed her this small, intimate act of care. The storm was their jailer, and the cabin their cell. But as the hours wore on, a new, more insidious enemy made its presence known. Rosie, who had been quiet and listless since the chaos began, developed a dry, rasping cough. Mary pressed a hand to the child's forehead. It was burning hot. A fever had taken hold. A new kind of fear, sharp and cold, pierced through Mary's exhaustion. She had seen fevers like this before, fevers that could sweep through a town and leave a trail of small graves in their wake. She set to work immediately, her movements calm and purposeful. She bathed Rosie's face and wrists with cool water. She coaxed sips of lukewarm tea between the child's dry lips. She sat with her, murmuring soft words of comfort, never leaving her side. Eli was lost. He paced the small cabin like a caged wolf, his large frame seeming to shrink with helplessness. This was an enemy he could not fight with his fists or his rifle. He could mend a roof, but he could not mend his own child. He felt a profound and terrifying inadequacy. "Should I boil more water?" he asked, his voice rough with anxiety. "The water is fine," Mary said softly, not looking up from Rosie. "Just keep the fire steady. We need to keep her warm, but not too warm." He obeyed, feeding the fire with a single-minded focus, as if the fate of the world rested on each log he placed. The night deepened, the storm outside showing no sign of abating. Rosie tossed and turned, caught in the clutches of a feverish dream, her small whimpers cutting through the roar of the wind. Mary stayed with her, her presence a constant, soothing anchor in the child's turbulent sea of sickness. As the darkest hours before dawn approached, the temperature plummeted. A bitter, penetrating cold seeped through the chinks in the cabin walls, a cold that seemed to mock the efforts of the fire. Mary, who had given her own blanket to Rosie, began to shiver. At first, it was a small tremor, but soon her whole body was shaking with a deep, uncontrollable chill. Eli saw it. He had been watching her all night, a silent, anxious shadow in the corner of the room. He saw the way her lips were turning blue, the same color he had seen on her that first night. He stood up, walked to his own cot, and took his heavy sheepskin coat from its peg. It was his warmest possession, worn and smelling of pine smoke and leather. He walked over to where she sat hunched by Rosie's side and draped it over her shoulders. The coat was heavy, and it enveloped her in a sudden, surprising warmth. She looked up at him, her eyes wide and grateful in the flickering firelight. He did not meet her gaze. Instead, he knelt before the hearth and stoked the fire, the poker clanging softly against the grate. He added another log, and the flames leaped up, casting their dancing light on his grim, focused face. Then he turned to her. "Your hands," he said, his voice a low rumble. She looked down at her own hands, which were clenched into tight fists in her lap, her knuckles white. He reached out, his large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle, and unfolded her fingers. He took her hands in his and held them out toward the fire, chafing them softly. The heat from the flames and the warmth from his touch slowly began to penetrate the deep, aching cold in her bones. He remembered the first night she had arrived. She knocked. Soaked and shivering, he stoked the fire, and here she was again, shivering, and here he was again, stoking the fire, trying to warm her. They stayed like that for a long time, kneeling before the fire, his hands covering hers. The storm howled outside, and Rosie breathed shallowly in her feverish sleep. But in that small circle of warmth, the world seemed to fall away. There was only the crackle of the flames, the heat on their skin, and the steady, solid presence of each other. Mary looked at his face, illuminated by the fire. She saw the exhaustion etched around his eyes, the deep lines of worry on his forehead. This was not the hard, unapproachable stranger who had taken her in. This was a frightened father, a lonely man, a fellow survivor. And he looked at her. He saw not the pitiful, desperate woman from the saloon, but a woman of quiet strength and deep compassion, a woman who had faced down his own daughter's sickness with a courage he could not find in himself. In the dancing golden light of the fire, the walls they had so carefully constructed around themselves seemed to dissolve into smoke. They were no longer strangers. They were two people clinging to a single point of warmth in the middle of a vast, cold, and hostile wilderness. "I just wanted to find a place," Mary whispered, her voice so soft he had to lean closer to hear her. "A place where someone needed me." The confession hung in the air between them, a fragile, heartbreakingly honest thing. Eli looked from her tired face to his sleeping daughter, and a truth he had been fighting for years finally broke through his defenses. "Maybe you have found it," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he could not name. The words, so quietly spoken, were a key turning in a long, locked door. The silence that followed was not empty, but filled with a new, tentative understanding. It was Mary who spoke first, her gaze fixed on the fire. "They mocked me in the town," she said, her voice flat, devoid of self-pity. "It is what people have always done. I was an orphan, passed from one house to another, never belonging anywhere, never good enough, always in the way." Eli listened, his hands still covering hers. When she was finished, he did not offer empty words of comfort. He offered a piece of his own brokenness instead. "My wife, Sarah," he began, his voice a low, painful rasp. "The town, they hated her. Because she was Comanche, because she was proud, because she was mine, and not theirs. One night, a mob came. They were full of drink and ugly talk. They said she had put a curse on their mine. I fought them, but there were too many." He paused, the memory, a physical weight on his shoulders. "I buried her on the hill behind this cabin. After that, I wanted nothing to do with any of them. I wanted nothing but silence." He had never told another living soul the full truth of it. To speak it now, to this woman, felt like lancing a wound that had been festering for years. She did not recoil from his story. She simply squeezed his hand, a small, silent gesture of shared sorrow. They were two sides of the same coin, two people who had been judged and condemned by the world outside this cabin. He looked at her then, truly looked at her, and saw his own loneliness reflected in her eyes. He saw the strength that had allowed her to survive, and the vulnerability she kept so carefully hidden. An impulse, foreign and yet deeply natural, moved him. He leaned forward, closing the small distance between them. Her eyes fluttered shut. He touched his lips to hers. It was not a kiss of passion. or of romance, or of any of the things he had once known. It was a kiss of profound, bone-deep weariness and a fragile, burgeoning hope. It was a trembling, uncertain thing, as quiet as the falling snow. It tasted of wood smoke and salt, a sharing of grief, and a tentative promise of solace. It was the simple, desperate acknowledgement of two lonely souls, finding in each other a reason to believe that they might not have to face the next storm alone. When they broke apart, the storm was still raging outside, but inside the battered cabin, something had shifted. The first light of dawn was beginning to pierce the gloom, and for the first time in a very long while, the crushing weight of solitude had begun to melt away, like ice in the warmth of a newly stoked fire. The storm passed as if it had never been, leaving behind a world scoured clean and unnervingly quiet. In its wake, Rosie's fever broke, leaving her weak but blessedly cool to the touch. The cabin, which had been a fortress under siege, became a sick room, and then, slowly, a home again. The question of Mary's departure hung in the air, a silent, unspoken thing. The trail was clearing. The world was passable again, but the path forward was no longer so simple. The shared ordeal had forged a new kind of connection between them, a fragile intimacy born of fear and shared warmth. The kiss by the fire had not been repeated, nor had it been mentioned, but it remained, a quiet hum beneath the surface of their days. Mary stayed. She told herself it was for Rosie, who was still too frail to be left alone. But she knew, in a recess of her heart she was not yet brave enough to explore, that she was staying for herself. She was staying because for the first time in her life, she did not feel entirely alone. The work of the cabin became her anchor. She taught Rosie how to knead dough for bread, her small hands delighting in the soft, pliable mass. She found a needle and thread and showed the little girl how to make clumsy but earnest stitches on a scrap of cloth. The cabin filled with the scent of baking and the soft murmur of their voices, sounds that pushed back against the encroaching silence of the wilderness. Eli, too, was changing. The hard shell of his solitude, cracked by the storm, had not resealed. He began to speak more, not in long conversations, but in small, offered fragments of himself. While whittling a piece of wood for Rosie one evening, he spoke of his time as a blacksmith, of the rhythmic music of the hammer on the anvil, the satisfaction of shaping raw, stubborn iron into something useful. Another day, watching Mary struggle to lift a heavy bucket, he took it from her and, as he walked to the creek, told a brief, unadorned story about the grueling marches he had endured as a cavalryman. Where a man's endurance was all he had, these were not stories meant to impress, but simple statements of fact, memories shared like stones worn smooth by time. His voice, a low and steady baritone, became a familiar current in the cabin's quiet air, and Mary found herself listening for it, learning the cadence of it, the way it softened almost imperceptibly when he spoke to his daughter. It was during one of these quiet afternoons, as Mary was mending the tear in the primer book, that she saw the letter again. Eli had placed it on the mantelpiece, a stark, white reminder of her arrival. She picked it up, her fingers tracing the elegant, looping script, a flicker of familiarity, a nagging echo in her memory, surfaced. She had seen this handwriting before. She closed her eyes, trying to place it. Then it came to her, a cold, sickening rush of recognition. It was the same handwriting that had been on a note passed to her in the saloon in Broken Horse weeks before she was dismissed. A note from Bo Sterling, the son of the mining foreman, a man whose smug advances she had politely but firmly rejected. The realization was a punch to the gut. The letter had not been a random, cruel prank. It had been personal. It had been a targeted act of revenge from a man whose vanity she had wounded. The fragile peace she had been carefully nurturing within herself shattered. The world felt unsafe again. The malice of others a specific and personal threat. She put the letter back, her hands trembling, and said nothing to Eli. The knowledge was a poison she kept to herself, and it began to curdle the quiet contentment of her days. A few days later, as the last of the snow was melting into muddy rivulets, a rider appeared on the trail. Mary saw him first from the window, a lone figure on a fine horse, riding with an easy arrogance. Her blood ran cold. It was Bo Sterling. He dismounted and strode toward the cabin as if he owned it, a self-satisfied smirk on his handsome face. Eli, who had been splitting wood, straightened up, his axe held loosely in one hand. He placed himself between the approaching man and the cabin door. "Carter," Bo said, his voice dripping with condescension. He did not bother to remove his hat. "Just checking on my investment. Heard the last storm was a bad one. Wanted to make sure my little joke did not cause any permanent damage." His eyes flicked past Eli to the cabin door, where Mary stood frozen in the shadows. His smirk widened into a triumphant grin. "Well, I will be. Look at that. It seems you found the place to your liking after all. Mary?" Eli's grip on the axe handle tightened, his knuckles turning white. Mary could see the muscles in his jaw bunch. She held her breath, expecting the quiet rage she had sensed in him before to finally explode. "She is just a bit of sport. Carter," Bo continued, enjoying the tension, prodding the silent man like a boy poking a dangerous animal with a stick. "A game to pass the time. You should not take it so seriously. When you are done with her, you can send her on back to town. I am sure I could find some use for her." The insult, so casually and cruelly delivered, was meant to ignite a fire. And it did. But Eli, to Mary's astonishment, did not lunge forward. He did not raise his voice. He simply stood there for a long moment, the silence stretching taut and thin. The memory of another mob, of a fire in the night, of a promise he had made to himself over a fresh grave, held him in check. When he finally spoke, his voice was unnervingly calm, colder and harder than any winter wind. "You have 5 seconds to get on your horse and ride off my land," he said. "If you are still here when I count to 5, I will use this axe to separate you from that fancy saddle of yours. 1. There was no bluff in his tone. It was a simple statement of intent, a promise of swift, efficient violence that was far more terrifying than any shouted threat. Bo's smirk faltered. He saw something in Eli's eyes, a deep, old darkness that he had not anticipated, and for the first time a flicker of fear replaced his arrogance. 2. Bo backed away, his hands held up in a placating gesture. No need for that, just a friendly visit. 3. He turned and practically scrambled onto his horse, fumbling with the reins. 4. He dug his heels into the horse's flanks and galloped away, not looking back. Eli watched him go, his body rigid, until he was just a small dot in the distance. Only then did he lower the axe. He turned, and his eyes met Mary's. She saw the immense effort the control had cost him, the fury still simmering just beneath the surface, but all she could feel was the acid of Bo's words, the fresh sting of her own humiliation. She was a game, a bit of sport. Her presence here was a joke, and now it was bringing danger to this small, quiet world. She turned and fled into the cabin, a choked sob escaping her lips. She could not stay. She was a magnet for trouble, a source of shame. She went to the corner where her few belongings were kept and began to bundle them into her old shawl. Her movements were frantic, desperate. She had to leave, to disappear, to erase herself from their lives before she caused any more harm. Rosie, who had been playing quietly on the floor, saw what she was doing. The little girl's face crumpled in confusion and fear. She ran to Mary, her small hands clutching at her skirt. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I have to go, sweetie," Mary said, not looking at her, her vision blurred by tears. Rosie's face twisted in a look of pure, uncomprehending terror. It was a look Mary would never forget. "No!" the child wailed, her small voice rising in a desperate plea. "No, Mama! Do not leave me again! Please do not go!" The word, "Mama," spoken not in sleepy confusion but in the agony of impending loss, shattered the last of Mary's composure. She sank to her knees, pulling the weeping child into her arms, her own sobs shaking her body. Eli filled the doorway, his large frame blocking out the light. He took in the scene, Mary on her knees, her pathetic bundle of belongings beside her, his daughter clinging to her as if to a life raft. His face was a mask of grief and exhaustion. He walked over and knelt before them. He did not speak to Rosie. He spoke to Mary, his voice low and rough. "Look at me, Mary." Slowly, she lifted her tear-stained face to his. "Do not," he said, his gaze holding hers with a quiet intensity. "Let the cruel games of a worthless man decide who you are. Do not let his ugliness decide where you belong." His words were not a command. They were an offering. He was not telling her to stay for him, or even for Rosie. He was telling her to stay for herself. He was telling her that she had a right to be here, that her worth was not defined by the scorn of others. It was the first time in her life that anyone had ever stood up for her, not with fists, but with faith, a fragile, trembling belief in her right to exist, to belong. She looked from his earnest, pained face to the tearful child in her arms, and for the first time, she did not feel the urge to run. She felt the urge to stay, to fight, to claim the small patch of ground on which she knelt. She pulled Rosie closer and gave a slow, deliberate nod. The next morning, the words remained unspoken, but the decision had been made. After their breakfast, Eli walked outside to the section of the rail fence that had been damaged in the storm. A post knocked loose, the rails splintered. He picked up a post hole digger and began to work. After a moment, Mary came out of the cabin, wiping her hands on her apron. She walked over to the pile of splintered rails and picked one up, testing its weight. He paused, watching her. "The wood is heavy," he said. "It was not a dismissal, just a statement." "I am stronger than I look," she replied, her voice steady. He nodded and went back to his digging. She began to clear away the broken pieces, stacking them neatly to be used as firewood. They worked all morning under the pale spring sun, a new rhythm establishing itself between them. He would dig the hole, and she would be ready with the new post. He would lift it into place, and she would hold it steady while he tamped the earth around it, his movements powerful and efficient. They did not speak much. They did not need to. They communicated in the shared effort, in the simple, satisfying physicality of the work. He would hand her a hammer, and her hand would be there to take it. She would point to a rail that was not quite level, and he would adjust it without a word. This was not a grand romantic gesture. It was the simple, profound act of two people rebuilding something that had been broken. They were mending a fence, but they were also mending the broken pieces of their own lives, creating a shared boundary against the world, a space that they were, together, beginning to call home. As the sun reached its zenith, they hammered the last rail into place. They stood back, side by side, and looked at their work. The fence was straight and strong, a dark, solid line against the greening earth. Their love was growing, not in the soil of pretty words or grand passions, but in the hard, unglamorous ground of mutual respect, shared labor, and the quiet, steady warmth of a fire that had been stoked against the cold. Bo Sterling's retreat did not end the conflict. It merely changed its form. He returned to Broken Horse not as a humbled man, but as a spurned one, his vanity wounded and festering into a venomous narrative. The story he told in the saloon was a masterful piece of fiction, casting himself as the concerned citizen who had tried to warn the reclusive widower about the cunning woman who had ensnared him. He painted Mary as a grifter, a woman of loose morals who had tricked her way into Eli's cabin with a fabricated story, preying on his grief and his child. The lie, watered with whiskey and fertilized by the town's inherent suspicion of outsiders, took root and grew with astonishing speed. Soon, the whispers followed any mention of the Carter place. "Heard he is keeping that thieving maid out there," men would mutter over their poker games. The one who got run out of the foreman's house, women gathered outside the general store, would shake their heads with pious disapproval. "It is not right," they would cluck. "A man like that, with a young daughter, to have such a woman in the house, it is a scandal." The town's collective memory was short on charity and long on judgment. The fact that they had driven Mary to Eli's cabin with their own cruelty was conveniently forgotten, buried under a fresh layer of self-righteous gossip. The gossip soon found its way to the ears of those in power, namely Beau's father, Mr. Sterling, the mine foreman who served as the town's unofficial mayor. He was a man whose authority was built on a foundation of public perception and moral superiority. The story of his son being threatened with an axe by the half-wild recluse living with a disgraced woman was a stain on his family's honor and a challenge to his control. He convened a meeting of the men who constituted the town council, a body that met in the back room of the saloon. Their purpose was cloaked in the language of civic duty. They spoke of morality, of protecting the community's character. But their true aim was land. Eli Carter's plot was well situated, with a steady creek and good timber. For years, it had been an irritant, a piece of private property on the edge of the mine's interests. Now, they had an excuse. "The man is an unstable element," Sterling declared, his voice booming with false concern. "He lives outside the bounds of our community, and now he is openly flouting its moral standards. The land patent he holds has clauses regarding its proper use. We have a duty to act." They drafted a formal notice, a document filled with legalistic jargon that amounted to a simple threat: conform to the town's standards, or forfeit your land. The notice was never delivered. A more direct and brutal message was sent instead. A few nights later, a new moon hid the world in a deep, impenetrable blackness. Mary was jolted from a light sleep by a strange smell, sharp and acrid. Smoke. At the same moment, a frantic whinnying sound came from outside, followed by the terrified scream of a horse. Then she saw it, a flicker of angry orange light dancing against the cabin window. She threw off her blanket and ran to the door. The sight that met her eyes was a vision from hell. The small stable, the one they had just repaired, was engulfed in flames. The fire was not a small blaze. It was a roaring, ravenous beast, consuming the dry timber with a terrible crackling hunger, sending a geyser of sparks and black smoke into the night sky. Her first thought was Rosie. Eli was already awake, pulling on his boots, his face a grim, taut mask in the demonic light. "Get Rosie," he commanded, his voice tight. "Take her up the hill, to the rocks. Do not come back, no matter what." Mary did not hesitate. She ran to Rosie's bed, scooped the sleeping child into her arms, wrapped her in a heavy blanket, and fled the cabin. She ran, her heart pounding against her ribs, until she reached the small outcropping of rocks on the hill behind the house, the place where Sarah was buried. From there, she had a clear, terrible view of the scene below. Eli was a lone figure battling a monster. He worked with a desperate, focused fury, releasing the terrified horse and driving it away from the flames before it could be consumed. He used buckets of water from the creek, a futile effort against such an inferno. The water seemed to turn to steam before it even touched the fire. He grabbed a wet blanket and began beating at the edges of the blaze, trying to prevent it from spreading to the tall, dry grass, and from there, to the cabin itself. He was a silhouette against the fire, a man throwing his entire being into a fight he could not possibly win. Mary watched, her hand pressed to her mouth, Rosie whimpering in her arms. She saw him stumble, regain his footing, and charge back into the choking smoke. She saw him swing the heavy, wet blanket again and again, his movements growing slower, more ragged. And then, as a section of the stable's roof collapsed in a shower of embers, she saw him fall to his knees and then pitch forward onto the scorched earth, disappearing into the smoke. A scream tore from her throat, She set Rosie down. "Stay here," she ordered the terrified child, her voice sharp with a command Rosie had never heard before. Then she ran down the hill, toward the fire, toward the place where Eli had fallen. The heat was a physical blow, the smoke a choking, blinding poison. She found him, an unmoving heap on the ground, and grabbed him under the arms. He was a dead weight, his body limp. She pulled, her muscles screaming in protest, dragging him inch by inch away from the inferno, away from the suffocating smoke, until they were in the clear, cool night air. His face was black with soot. His hair and shirt were singed. He was not breathing. Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. She remembered something she had seen a doctor do once. She pressed on his chest, hard. Once, twice. He gave a great, shuddering gasp, and then another, his lungs fighting for air. He was alive. The stable was a lost cause, a roaring pyre that would burn itself out. The fire had not spread. The cabin was safe. Rosie was safe. He was alive. She collapsed beside him, her body trembling with adrenaline and exhaustion, and watched the last of the stable burn itself into a pile of glowing red ashes. He awoke to the gentle light of dawn filtering into the cabin. His head throbbed, and his throat felt like it had been scraped with sand. Every muscle in his body ached with a profound, deep-set weariness. He was in his own bed. He tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness forced him back down. Then he became aware of a presence beside him. Mary was sitting in a chair next to his bed, her head slumped forward, asleep. Her face was smudged with soot, and there were dark circles of exhaustion under her eyes. One of her hands was resting on his, a light, warm weight. He looked at her hands. They were red and angry. The skin on her palms and fingers raised in painful, watery blisters. She had fought the fire too. After dragging him to safety, she must have gone back, fighting the encroaching flames with buckets and wet sacks, protecting their home. He lay there, watching her. A wave of emotion so powerful it felt like a physical blow washing over him. This woman, who had come to his door with nothing, who had been the butt of a cruel joke, who owed him nothing, had risked her own life to save his. She had protected his child and his home. As if sensing his gaze, she stirred, her eyes fluttering open. They were red-rimmed but clear. She saw he was awake, and a look of profound relief softened her tired features. "Eli," she whispered. She did not move her hand. He looked from her face to her blistered hands, and a shame deeper than any he had ever known settled upon him. His silence, his isolation, his pride. He had thought he was protecting his family, but he had only made them a target. He had brought this destruction upon them. As if reading his thoughts, she tightened her grip on his hand. "I used to run," she said, her voice quiet but strong, with no trace of the victim he had first met. "All my life, whenever things got hard, or people were cruel. I ran from every place I have ever been." She looked him directly in the eye, and he saw a strength there he had never seen before, a core of tempered steel. "I am not running from here. This is my home now, and I will not let them burn it down." Her words were a declaration of war, but also a declaration of belonging. She had not said your home. She had said my home. In that moment, something shifted in the foundations of Eli's world. A few days later, once Eli was back on his feet and Mary's hands had begun to heal, she made another declaration. She was holding the letter, the one from Bo Sterling. "He will not stop," she said, her voice calm and resolute. "His father will not stop. They will keep coming for us, for this land, until they have taken it. We cannot hide from them." "What do you propose we do?" Eli asked, his own voice still rough from the smoke. "I propose we stop hiding," she said. "I am going into town. I am going to the saloon, and I am going to tell every person in that room the truth. I am going to show them this letter." The idea was terrifying. To walk into that place, the heart of her humiliation, and confront the most powerful man in town, seemed like suicide, but as he looked at her, he saw no fear in her eyes, only a cold, hard resolve. They rode into Broken Horse together that afternoon. The town fell silent as they passed, windows parting, men stopping their conversations to stare. Eli Carter, the recluse, and the woman he was keeping. He hitched their horse outside the saloon and followed Mary through the swinging doors. The saloon was crowded, the air thick with the smell of stale beer and sweat. The room went quiet, the clink of glasses and the murmur of conversation dying away as every eye turned to them. Bo Sterling was at the bar, a glass of whiskey in his hand. His father, the foreman, was holding court at a corner table. Mary did not hesitate. She walked to the center of the room, her back straight, her head held high. Eli stood just inside the door, his hand resting near the pistol on his hip, his presence a silent, deadly promise. "I have something to say," Mary announced, her voice clear and carrying to every corner of the room. "Many of you know me only by the stories you have been told. You have been told I am a thief. You have been told I am a woman of low character who tricked my way into a good man's home." She looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the silent, staring men. "Tonight, I am here to tell you the truth." She held up the letter. "This is the letter that brought me to Eli Carter's home. It is a letter offering me a job as a housekeeper, a job to care for his daughter, a job that did not exist." She turned her gaze directly on Bo Sterling, who was watching her with a mixture of amusement and contempt. This letter was written by a coward. It was a cruel joke, written by a man who thought it was sport to play with a woman's hope. Her voice rose, ringing with a conviction that made people lean in to listen. "The man who wrote this letter, who sent me out into a blizzard to nearly die, is the same man who has been spreading lies about me ever since. That man is Bo Sterling." A collective gasp went through the room. Bo's face turned from a smirk to a mask of fury. "That is a lie," he snarled. "Is it?" Mary said calmly. She walked over to the bar and laid the letter down. "Then you will not mind if the rest of the town compares your handwriting, will you?" "Mr. Sterling rose to his feet, his face purple with rage. "This is an outrage. This woman is a liar and a troublemaker, Sheriff. Arrest her for slander." But the sheriff, leaning against the bar, did not move. He was looking at the letter, and then at the faces of the other men in the room. He saw not anger at Mary, but a dawning understanding. They were miners, rough men, but they were not without a sense of fairness. They remembered the girl, scrubbing floors, keeping to herself. They remembered Bo, bragging about his cruel joke. And they saw the woman standing before them now, not weeping or pleading, but standing tall, her voice unwavering, demanding not pity, but justice. They saw the quiet courage it took for her to walk in here and do this, and for the first time, they began to believe her. Eli watched it all from the doorway. He watched as the tide of opinion in the room, so long set against him, began to turn. He saw the respect, grudging but real, in the eyes of the men looking at Mary. He had lived his life by the code of the West, a code of strength, of silence, of meeting threats with violence. But Mary was fighting a different kind of battle, with different weapons, truth and courage, and she was winning. He looked at her, standing alone in the center of that hostile room, and he no longer saw a victim he needed to protect. He saw a warrior. He saw the woman who had not only saved his life from a fire, but was now saving him from the prison of silence and isolation he had built for himself. She was pulling him back into the world, not by asking him to change, but by showing him that some things were worth fighting for in the light. The ride back from Broken Horse was a silent one, but it was a silence of a different quality than any they had shared before. It was not the silence of strangers, nor the heavy silence of unspoken grief. It was a comfortable, settled quiet, the kind that exists between two people who have faced a common enemy and stood their ground together. Mary rode beside Eli, her back straight, the cool evening air on her face feeling like a benediction. She had walked into the lion's den and had not been devoured. She had spoken her truth, and in the stunned silence of the saloon, she had felt a lifetime of shame begin to fall away like a heavy, threadbare coat, as if in answer to the shift in their own small world, the world around them began to change. The long, brutal winter finally released its grip on the land. A Chinook wind, warm and smelling of damp earth and melting snow, swept down from the mountains, and in a matter of days, the landscape was transformed. The stark white and black of winter gave way to the soft browns and tender greens of spring. The creek, which had been a choked ribbon of ice, began to run full and fast, its cheerful gurgle replacing the mournful howl of the wind. The air grew soft, and the sun, once a distant, indifferent disk, now felt warm on the skin. Behind the cabin stood an old, gnarled apple tree that Eli's wife, Sarah, had planted years ago. Mary had thought it was dead, its branches bare and twisted like the arthritic fingers of an old woman. But now, as the spring deepened, the tree underwent a miracle. Tiny green buds appeared, and then, almost overnight, it exploded into a riot of delicate pink and white blossoms. The sight was so unexpectedly beautiful, so full of resilient life, that it brought tears to Mary's eyes. It felt like a promise, a sign that even in the hardest ground, after the longest winter, life could return. The new season brought with it a new ease between them. The rigid boundaries they had maintained began to soften. One sunny afternoon, Eli led his horse, a steady buckskin gelding named Buck. From the makeshift lean-to he had built, he looked at Mary, who was watching him from the cabin doorway. "It is time you learned to ride properly," he said. It was not a question. Fear and excitement warred within her. She had been on a horse only a few times in her life, and always as a passenger. He helped her up, his hand strong and sure on her waist, lifting her onto the saddle as if she weighed nothing. The world looked different from this new height, wider and full of possibility. He did not get on behind her. Instead, he took the reins and led the horse at a slow walk around the clearing, his voice a low, calm murmur, explaining how to hold the reins, how to shift her weight, how to communicate with the animal beneath her. He was a patient teacher, his instructions clear and simple. He showed her how to use the pressure of her knees, the gentle pull on the reins. Slowly, her fear gave way to a sense of exhilaration. She felt the powerful muscles of the horse moving beneath her, a feeling of controlled strength, of freedom. After a while, he handed her the reins. "You have it," he said. "Just breathe. Trust the horse, and trust yourself." She urged Buck into a slow trot, her body bouncing awkwardly at first. Eli walked beside her, his hand never far from the bridle, and then she found the rhythm. She rose and fell with the horse's gait, a feeling of perfect, fluid motion. A pure, unadulterated joy bubbled up inside her, a feeling so foreign she did not at first recognize it. A laugh escaped her lips, not a small, polite sound, but a loud, clear peal of delighted laughter that echoed in the quiet afternoon air. It was the first time she had truly laughed since the day she had first knocked on his door. Eli stopped walking and looked up at her. He saw the flush on her cheeks, the sparkle in her eyes, the way the sunlight caught in her dark hair. And he saw a woman he had not seen before, not a victim or a survivor, but a woman full of life and light. The sound of her laughter did something to the tight, frozen knot in his chest. He felt it loosen, just a little. They began to work together as a matter of course, their days falling into a pattern of shared labor that was as natural as breathing. The leaky roof needed more than the temporary patch of snow. They spent 2 days up there, Eli expertly replacing the split shingles, Mary handing him the tools and nails, their movements synchronized. A team. They turned over the hard soil in the small plot beside the cabin, the plot Sarah had once tended. They planted seeds for beans and squash and corn, their hands dark with the rich, fertile earth. Mary found she loved the feel of it, the promise of life held within a tiny, dormant seed. The cabin was no longer just his shelter or her refuge. It was their home, a place they were building and tending together. One evening, after Mary had tucked Rosie into bed, she came out to find the little girl had followed her, her small face serious in the dim light. Rosie climbed into her lap as she sat by the fire and whispered into her ear, "A secret just for them. Papa is smiling again," she said, her voice soft as a moth's wing. "He did not smile for a long, long time, but he smiles now, because of you." The innocent words went straight to Mary's heart, a sweet, aching arrow of truth. She had seen it herself, the subtle changes in him, the way the hard lines around his eyes would soften when he watched her with Rosie, the ghost of a smile that sometimes touched his lips when she told a story. She held Rosie tight, her own eyes filling with tears. A few nights later, Eli approached her as she sat mending one of Rosie's dresses. He was holding something in his hands, a folded piece of soft wool. He held it out to her. It was a shawl, intricately embroidered with a pattern of wildflowers and hummingbirds. The stitches so fine and detailed they looked like a painting. The colors were still vibrant, the wool soft and clearly of high quality. It was a thing of beauty, a piece of art made with love and immense skill. "Sarah made this," he said, his voice low and a little rough. "She was working on it the winter before. She never finished it." He pointed to a small corner where the pattern was incomplete. "She would have wanted someone to have the warmth of it." Mary looked from the beautiful shawl to his face. She understood the magnitude of the gesture. This was not just a gift. It was a piece of his heart, a piece of his past. He was letting her in, not just into his home, but into his grief. He was sharing his most precious memories with her. The tears that had threatened before now fell freely, tracking silent paths down her cheeks. She took the shawl, her fingers stroking the soft wool, the delicate stitches. "I cannot replace her, Eli," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I could never be her." He reached out and placed his hand over hers, his touch warm and steady on her skin. "I am not asking you to replace anyone," he said, his voice full of a quiet, profound sincerity. "I am just asking you to stay." His words were the simplest and most beautiful she had ever heard. She looked up at him through her tears, and he was looking at her with an expression of such raw tenderness that it took her breath away. He was not just the grim, silent man she had first met. He was a man of deep feeling, a man who had loved fiercely and lost tragically, and who was now, against all odds, learning to open his heart again. He leaned down and kissed her. It was not like the first, desperate kiss in the storm. This was a kiss of quiet certainty, of warmth and gentle longing. It was a kiss that spoke of shared work and easy silences, of mutual respect and a slow, dawning affection. It was a kiss that tasted of spring air and wood smoke and the promise of a future. It was a kiss that felt like coming home. When they parted, they were not alone. Rosie was standing in the doorway of her room, a small, silent observer. But there was no fear or confusion on her face. She was simply watching them, her head tilted to one side, and on her lips was a small, knowing, innocent smile. In her eyes, the world was finally as it should be. The broken pieces of her small family were being put back together, made whole again by the gentle hands of this kind woman. And for a moment, the cabin, with its rough-hewn walls and simple furniture, felt like the most beautiful and perfect place on earth. The next day, they began to rebuild the stable. The pile of charred ashes was a grim reminder of the hatred that had tried to destroy them. But as they worked to clear the ground, to lay a new foundation, it no longer felt like a scar. It felt like a testament to their resilience. Eli cut new logs, his axe swinging with a powerful, steady rhythm. Mary helped him strip the bark, her once soft hands now calloused and capable. They worked side by side under the vast Montana sky, the sun warm on their backs. As the new walls began to rise, the setting sun cast a long, golden light across the clearing, turning Mary's dark hair to fire and illuminating the flecks of silver in Eli's beard. They were not burying the past. They were building a new future from its ashes, log by log, nail by nail, together. The fragile peace of the burgeoning spring was a fleeting gift. A few weeks after they had rebuilt the stable, a late, cruel winter storm swept back down from the north. A final, spiteful gasp from the season. It came without warning. A sudden drop in temperature and a sky that turned the color of lead. Fine. Hard pellets of snow began to hiss through the air, driven by a wind that had a familiar, predatory bite. The apple blossoms, so full of life just a day before, shriveled and fell, a dusting of pink and white confetti on the rapidly whitening ground. Eli was outside, securing the new stable door, when he saw them, 3 riders, dark shapes moving slowly through the gray curtain of the snow. They were not lost travelers. They rode with a grim purpose, their shoulders hunched against the wind, their hats pulled low. He recognized the man in the lead instantly, even from a distance. Bo Sterling. The 2 men flanking him were strangers, hard-faced men with rifles resting easy across their saddles. They were not miners. They were the kind of men who drifted from town to town, their only trade being the cold, efficient use of a gun. A cold dread, familiar and sickening, settled in Eli's stomach. This was not about mockery or land anymore. This was about a humiliation that had festered into a murderous rage. This was revenge. He moved quickly, his action stripped of all wasted motion. He entered the cabin, his face a hard, unreadable mask that sent a chill through Mary's heart. "Get Rosie," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Now." He did not have to explain. She saw the truth in his eyes. She grabbed the bewildered child and a thick blanket. Eli was already prying up the floorboards in the corner of the room that concealed the small root cellar, a dark earthen hole used for storing potatoes and preserves. "Get in," he commanded. "Both of you. And you do not make a sound. You do not come out. No matter what you hear. Do you understand me? Mary." She looked at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. She saw the rifle he was taking from the wall. She saw the box of cartridges he was stuffing into his coat pocket. This was real. "Eli, no," she pleaded, her voice a whisper. "You cannot face them alone." "This is not a discussion," he said, his voice harder than she had ever heard it. It was the voice of a soldier giving an order. "I will not lose my family. Not again. Now get in." Tears streaming down her face, she helped a frightened Rosie down the short ladder into the cold, dark space, just before Eli replaced the floorboards. He looked down at her, his eyes burning with a fierce, desperate light. "Keep her safe," he said, and then the world went black. Above them, Mary could hear his footsteps as he moved the heavy table to barricade the cabin door. She huddled in the darkness, wrapping Rosie tightly in the blanket, murmuring reassurances she did not feel. The cellar smelled of damp earth and potatoes. She could hear the muffled scream of the wind outside, and beneath it, the frantic, terrified beating of her own heart. Eli stood by the window, a small pane of glass he had scraped clear of frost, and watched them approach. They dismounted, leaving their horses untethered, a sign of their confidence. They fanned out, moving with a practiced coordination, taking cover behind the trees and the woodpile. Carter Bow's voice was a triumphant shout, barely carried by the wind. "I have come to collect a debt you and that little tramp of yours owe me for the embarrassment you caused. We can do this easy, or we can do this hard." Eli remained silent, his rifle held steady. To answer would be to give away his position. The first gunshot came without warning, a deafening crack that shattered the window pane, sending a spray of glass and snow into the cabin. Eli was already moving, dropping to the floor and rolling behind the stone hearth, the bullet thudding into the log wall where he had just been standing. The fight began in earnest. It was a chaotic symphony of violence. the roar of Eli's rifle from inside the cabin, answered by the sharp cracks of the pistols and rifles from outside. Gunsmoke filled the small room, acrid and biting. Bullets tore through the walls, splintering the wood, punching holes in the tin plates on the shelf. In the cellar, Mary and Rosie huddled together, each explosion making the ground tremble. Rosie was sobbing, her face buried in Mary's dress. Mary held her body a shield, her mind a whirlwind of terror. She could hear the sounds of the fight, the gunshots, the shouts, the sickening thud of lead hitting wood. She was trapped in the dark, listening to the man she loved fight for their lives. Eli fought with a cold, desperate precision. He was a soldier again, his training taking over. He moved from the hearth to the overturned table, using every piece of cover, making every shot count. He wounded one of the hired guns, a cry of pain from behind the wood pile telling him his bullet had found its mark. But he was one man against three. They were trying to draw his fire, to flank him. He knew it was only a matter of time. Down in the cellar. Mary's terror began to curdle into a fierce, unbearable resolve. She could not do this. She could not huddle in the dark and wait for the gunshots to stop. Wait to learn his fate by the silence that followed. She thought of his words. I am not asking you to replace anyone. I am just asking you to stay. Staying meant fighting. It meant standing with him, not hiding beneath him. She made a decision. She kissed Rosie's forehead. I will be right back, she whispered. You stay here and be quiet as a mouse. Promise me. The child, too terrified to speak, just nodded. Mary climbed the ladder and pushed carefully on the floorboards. They shifted, and a sliver of gray, smoke-filled light appeared. She peered through the crack. She could see the whole scene. She saw the wounded man propped against the wood pile, still firing. She saw Bo Sterling, his face contorted in a mask of rage, shouting orders from behind a large pine tree. And she saw the third man, the uninjured one, creeping silently along the side of the cabin, making his way to the now shattered window, his pistol raised, ready to get a clear shot at Eli, who was pinned down behind the table, exchanging fire with Bo. Her mind raced. There was no time to think, only to act. Beside the cellar opening was a small pile of firewood she had brought in that morning. She grabbed the heaviest piece she could lift, a solid, gnarled piece of oak. It was heavy and awkward in her hands. The hired gun reached the window. He raised his pistol, taking careful aim at Eli's exposed back. In that instant, Mary heaved the floorboards aside, scrambled out of the cellar, and, with a scream that was part rage and part terror, she ran at the man. He heard her cry and turned, his eyes wide with surprise. But he was too late. She brought the heavy log down with all her strength, striking his gun arm. There was a sickening crack of bone, and the pistol flew from his grasp, landing in the snow. He howled in pain, clutching his shattered wrist. The momentary distraction was all Eli needed. He turned, saw the scene at the window, and fired. Bo Sterling, who had stepped out from behind the tree to get a better angle, cried out and staggered back, a dark stain blossoming on his thigh. It was then that new riders appeared through the swirling snow. It was the sheriff, his face grim, followed by two of the miners from the saloon, men who had witnessed Mary's stand and whose consciences had been stirred. They had seen Bo and his hired guns ride out of town and had followed. Suspecting trouble, they arrived to the scene of a full-blown gunfight, with Bo Sterling clearly the aggressor. The fight was over. The wounded hired gun surrendered immediately. The other clutched his broken arm, moaning in pain. Bo lay in the snow, clutching his leg, his face a mask of disbelief and agony. His private war had become a public crime. Mary ran to Eli. He was leaning against the table, his face pale, his breathing ragged. There was a dark, wet patch spreading across his left shoulder. Eli, she cried, her hand going to the wound. He winced. It is not bad, he grunted, but his face was slick with sweat. She tore a strip from her petticoat and pressed it against the wound. her hands covered in his blood. She helped him to a chair, his arm around her shoulders, his weight heavy against her. He looked at her then, his eyes full of a fierce, aching tenderness. He looked past her, at the smoke still curling from the bullet holes in his walls, at the snow falling outside, at the sheriff disarming his enemies. "I lost her because I was silent," he said, his voice a raw whisper. "I thought I could stand against their hate alone. I thought I could protect her by building walls. I was wrong." He turned his gaze back to her, his grip tightening on her arm. "I will not lose you because I was afraid to speak. I will not lose this because I was afraid to claim it." He was bleeding, exhausted, and in pain. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and scorched wood. But in his eyes, Mary saw a clarity and a purpose that eclipsed all the chaos around them. "Mary Dalton," he said, his voice gaining strength, "if we are alive to see the sun tomorrow, will you stay with me? Will you be my wife?" Tears welled in her eyes, hot and cleansing, washing away the soot and the fear. She looked at this man, this stubborn, silent, beautiful man who had fought for her, and who was now offering her the one thing she had never had in her entire life, a home. She leaned down, her tears falling onto his face, and touched her forehead to his. "I already chose," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I chose the night you stoked the fire." He pulled her closer, his good arm wrapping around her waist, and kissed her. It was a kiss of raw, desperate, and triumphant love, a kiss that sealed a vow amidst the wreckage of a battle. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the scene in a soft, quiet white, a promise of peace on the other side of the fire and the gun. The aftermath of the gunfight was a strange and hollow silence, broken only by the whimpering of the wind through the shattered window and the steady hiss of falling snow. The sheriff and his small posse had taken Beau and his wounded men away, their dark shapes disappearing into the gray whirlwind, leaving behind a scene of quiet devastation. The snow, falling thick and fast, was already beginning to cover the dark stains on the ground, a soft white blanket over the raw violence. Eli's recovery was a slow, grudging battle fought in the quiet confines of the cabin. The bullet had torn through the muscle of his shoulder, and a fever, born of the wound and deep exhaustion, took hold of him for days. He drifted in a painful haze, the world reduced to the four walls of the room, the scent of wood smoke, and the constant, gentle presence of Mary. She was his anchor in the feverish sea. She bathed his hot forehead with cool cloths. She cleaned and dressed the wound with a calm competence that belied her trembling hands. She brewed bitter herbal teas that he drank without protest. She sat by his bed through the long nights, her chair pulled close, her presence a silent, unwavering vigil. In his moments of lucidity, he would watch her. He saw the deep exhaustion in her face, the way she would sometimes close her eyes for just a moment, her body slumping with weariness before she straightened her spine and carried on. He saw her hands, still tender from their burns, as she spooned broth to his lips. He saw a strength in her that was as profound and as quiet as the ancient mountains outside their window. Rosie, too, became a part of his healing. The terror of the gunfight had left her clinging and quiet for a day, but seeing her father so helpless seemed to awaken a new, solemn maturity in her. She would sit on a small stool by his bed for hours, a small, still figure, Mary, seeing the child's need to contribute, began to write simple stories for her on scraps of paper, tales of brave squirrels and clever rabbits who outwitted grumpy bears. Rosie, her small brow furrowed in concentration, would then read these stories aloud to her father. Her childish voice, stumbling over the longer words, was a sweet, gentle music that soothed the ragged edges of his pain. It was the sound of his world, broken and battered, slowly, carefully, being pieced back together. About a week after the fight, they had their first visitor. The sound of an approaching horse made Mary's heart leap into her throat. But when she peered out the window, she saw it was only the sheriff, riding alone. He dismounted, his movement slow and deliberate, and knocked softly on the door. He held his hat in his hands, a gesture of respect she had never expected to see from him. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Just came to see how he was faring." He glanced past her to where Eli lay in his cot, and to say that what you did back in the saloon, that took guts, and what you both did here. We were wrong. The town was wrong. He cleared his throat. A deep, gravelly sound. Sterling and his boy are being sent to the territorial prison. His hired guns, too. Things are going to be different around here. He did not stay long, but he left a burlap sack on the table containing flour, sugar, and coffee. A silent, practical apology from the town's highest authority. He was the first, but he was not the last. A few days later, one of the miners' wives, a woman who had once looked through Mary with cold disdain, appeared at the door with a freshly baked apple pie. She mumbled a few awkward words about being sorry for the trouble, and left before Mary could properly thank her. Then another family came, leaving a side of bacon. They came not in a flood, but as a slow, steady trickle of atonement. They brought small gifts, tokens of peace. They spoke to Mary with a new, grudging respect. They saw her not as the town's fool or a woman of questionable morals, but as a woman who had stood her ground, who had protected her own with a courage they had to admire. They were rebuilding a bridge, not just to Eli, but to their own better natures. It was during one of these visits that the seed of a new idea was planted. A miner named Jebediah, a man who had laughed at Bo's cruel joke, came with his wife and their 2 young sons. The boys, shy and restless, watched with wide eyes as Rosie sat at the kitchen table, painstakingly forming letters on her slate. "Look at that," Jebediah's wife said in amazement. "She can write her name already. Our boys can barely tell enough from a mule's hind leg." That night, after their visitors had gone, Mary looked at the small, crowded cabin, at the children of this rough, wild place with no school and no one to teach them. A thought, bold and clear, formed in her mind. The next morning, she cleaned the large kitchen table until it shone. She sharpened a piece of chalk. When the next family came to visit, she invited their children to sit with Rosie for an hour. She taught them their letters, drawing the shapes on the slate, having them repeat the sounds. It was chaotic and clumsy, but by the end of the hour, 2 more children had learned to write the first letter of their own names. Word spread. The kitchen became a classroom. Every afternoon, a small group of children would tramp up the path to the cabin. Mary taught them reading, simple arithmetic, and the names of the states. The cabin, once a house of silence, was now filled with the sound of children's voices, the scrape of chalk on slate, and Mary's patient, steady instruction. Eli, now strong enough to sit in a chair by the fire, would watch it all, a quiet, unreadable expression on his face. He saw the light in Mary's eyes as she taught, the natural grace and authority she possessed. He saw the respect and affection the children had for her, and he saw his small, crowded kitchen. One morning, when he was finally able to walk without dizziness, he went out to the pile of fresh timber they had cut for the stable. He began to work. Mary would hear the rhythmic sound of his saw, the sharp tap of his hammer, all day long. A few days later, he carried his work into the house, 2 small, sturdy wooden desks and 4 benches, all sanded smooth, smelling of fresh pine. He had built a school. The people of the town, when they heard, were amazed. They started referring to the place not as the Carter Cabin, but as Schoolhouse Ridge. The name stuck, a landmark of the change that had taken place not just on the land, but in the hearts of the people. As his shoulder healed and his strength returned fully, Eli built one more thing. It was a bookshelf, made of dark, polished pine, tall and strong. He installed it on the wall next to the hearth. It was a gift for Mary, a place for the few books they owned and the new ones that might one day come. When it was finished, he took a small glass jar from the mantelpiece. Inside it was the letter. The cruel, forged document that had started everything. It was charred around the edges, a relic from the night of the fire. He placed the jar on the top shelf of the new bookcase. Mary looked at him, a question in her eyes. "So we can remember how we started," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "But not so we are haunted by it." He took her hand. "It brought you here. For that, I cannot bring myself to destroy it completely." One afternoon, as the first hints of summer began to warm the air, Mary was teaching Rosie how to write a new word. She drew the letters carefully on the slate Family. Rosie copied them, her small tongue sticking out of the corner of her mouth in concentration. Her letters were clumsy and uneven, but they were clear. She held the slate up for Mary to see. Mary smiled and nodded her approval. Rosie then bent over the slate again, her small hand moving with a fierce, determined purpose. When she held it up again, there was a new word written just below the first one, Finally. Mary looked at the two words, at the profound and simple truth the child had written, and her heart felt so full she thought it might break. The summer arrived in a glorious wave of warmth and color. The apple tree, which they had feared was lost after the last storm, proved them wrong. It was now laden with small, green apples, growing heavier by the day, a testament to the stubborn resilience of life. The world was green and lush, the sky a high, brilliant blue. The scars on the land, both from the fire and the fight, were covered over with new grass and wildflowers. One warm evening, after Rosie was asleep, they sat together on the small porch Eli had built. The air was soft, filled with the scent of pine and the gentle chirping of crickets. The fire glowed warmly through the open cabin door, and the last light of the setting sun painted the western sky in brilliant strokes of orange and purple. The snow was gone from the hills, a distant memory of a hard season past. They sat in a comfortable silence, watching the stars begin to prick the darkening sky. "Some people say the West is only about killing," Eli said, his voice a quiet reflection. "About taking, about what you can carve out of it for yourself before it kills you." He looked out at the vast, peaceful landscape that was his home. "For me, it gave me back my life." Mary leaned her head on his good shoulder. She felt the solid, steady strength of him. She thought of the desperate, freezing woman who had stumbled to his door, and the woman she was now, a woman with a home, a purpose, and a family. "And love," she added, her voice a soft whisper in the twilight. He turned his head and looked at her, and in his eyes she saw all the love and gratitude her heart could ever hope to hold. He took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers, a simple, perfect gesture of belonging, and together they sat in the quiet dark, holding hands, watching the dawn of their new season. A year passed, the seasons turned, washing the land in the brilliant greens of summer, the fiery golds of autumn, and then burying it once more in the deep, cleansing silence of winter. When the spring returned again, it felt not like a fragile truce, but like a settled and lasting peace. The town of Broken Horse, once a place of raw edges and hard hearts, had begun to soften, its wounds slowly beginning to scar over into something resembling a community. To celebrate its survival and the promise of a prosperous mining season, the town decided to hold its first ever Founders' Day festival. The main street, usually a river of mud or a channel of dust, had been scraped and tidied. Bunting, made from scraps of colored cloth and old flour sacks, was strung between the leaning buildings. The air, which normally carried the sharp scent of coal smoke and whiskey, was now filled with the rich aroma of roasting pig and the sweet smell of freshly baked pies. A fiddler, brought in from a town 2 days' ride away, sat on a barrel and played a lively, cheerful tune that got feet tapping. It was a clumsy, heartfelt celebration, a town learning how to be a town. In the midst of the cheerful chaos, a small girl with dark hair and her mother's laughing eyes darted through the crowd. a wildflower tucked behind her ear. It was Rosie. But this was not the shy, quiet child who had lived her life in the shadow of a silent cabin. This Rosie was bright and bold, her laughter a constant, silvery thread in the tapestry of the festival's sounds. She was known by everyone. The miners would tip their hats to her, their gruff faces breaking into unaccustomed smiles. The women would offer her small pieces of candy and comment on how tall she was getting. She was no longer just Eli Carter's girl. She was the town's child, the first student of the schoolhouse ridge, a living, breathing symbol of the hope that had been so scarce for so long. Her mother, Mary, watched her from the shade of the general store's porch. She was wearing a simple calico dress, but over it, despite the warmth of the spring day, she wore a man's heavy, worn sheepskin coat. It was the coat Eli had wrapped around her shoulders during the blizzard, the one he had given her the night Rosie's fever had raged. It was too big for her, the sleeves rolled up, but she wore it with a quiet, unadorned pride. It was her history. It was a reminder of a cold night and a stoked fire, of a moment when a stranger's simple, practical act of warmth had saved her in more ways than one. It was her wedding ring, her testament, her banner. Eli stood a little ways off, leaning against a support post for the porch roof. He was not the same man. The hard, forbidding wall he had built around himself was gone, dismantled brick by brick. The deep lines of grief and anger around his eyes had softened into the crow's feet of a man who now knew how to smile. He was still quiet, his words still chosen with care, but his silence was no longer a fortress. It was a peaceful harbor. He watched his wife and his daughter, and a look of such profound, settled contentment was on his face that it seemed to light him from within. He was no longer on the edge of the community, an outsider looking in. He was a part of it, a quiet, solid pillar around which a new kind of town was being built. Mary had become a cornerstone of that new town. The afternoon lessons in her kitchen had grown until the cabin could no longer hold all the children who wanted to learn, with lumber donated by the mining company and labor provided by the fathers of her students. A small, proper schoolhouse had been built in the clearing not far from their cabin. It was a simple, one-room structure, but to the people of Broken Horse, it was as grand as any cathedral. Above the door, Eli, with his blacksmith skill, had burned a name into a wide plank of pine. It did not say Broken Horse School. It said, in clean, strong letters, Hope Cabin School. It was Mary's school, a place born not from a town ordinance, but from one woman's quiet determination to create a better world in a small corner of the wilderness. Later that afternoon, as the festival began to wind down, Mary sat on a bench with a small, folded piece of paper in her hand. It was a letter she had received that morning from her first student, a shy boy named Thomas, whose father had been one of the men who had initially laughed at her in the saloon. The boy was moving with his family to a new territory, and he had written her a farewell note. She had read it a dozen times, and each time, her heart swelled. She read it again, her lips moving silently, the boy's clumsy, heartfelt words a balm to her soul. She came to the last line, a line that had made her weep when she first read it. My PA says you are the best thing that ever happened to this town, the boy had written. And Teacher Eli said something I will not ever forget. He said the fire is not just for warmth. He said sometimes, it is for lighting the way. As the sun began to dip toward the jagged peaks of the mountains, painting the sky in fiery hues, they made their way home. The sounds of the festival faded behind them, replaced by the gentle evening sounds of the wilderness. When they reached their cabin, Mary paused on the doorstep. She noticed something new. There, on the wide, smooth log that served as the threshold, Eli had carved something. The letters were deep and clear, filled with the same love and care with which he had built the school desks and the bookshelf. She knelt down and traced the words with her fingers. She knocked. Soaked and shivering, he stoked the fire, and found his true love in this cabin. It was their story, their beginning, carved into the very foundation of their home. a permanent welcome. He had taken the most painful and humiliating moment of her life and transformed it into a monument to their love. She looked up at him, her eyes shining with tears, and he pulled her to her feet and into his arms. That night, they sat on the porch together. A family. Rosie, sleepy and content, was nestled between them, her head resting on her father's lap. The air was cool and sweet. The great gnarled apple tree was covered in new, green leaves, the small, hard knobs of the season's apples a promise of the sweet harvest to come. Inside the cabin, a gentle fire burned in the hearth, its warm, golden light spilling out through the open door, a beacon of peace and welcome in the vast, quiet dark. The town had finally understood what Eli and Mary now knew in their bones. The West would not be won by guns and gold alone. It would be built by the quiet, resilient strength of ordinary people, by the stubborn belief in second chances, by the simple, revolutionary act of offering warmth to a stranger in a storm. It would be built by love. The sun had set, the world was at peace, and their life, which had begun in the ashes of a fire, had been reborn, whole and beautiful and true. Thank you so much for listening to our story tonight. We would love for you to comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales. Like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story and others like it can be heard by more people.